ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
On a Sunday afternoon a few years ago, Dasha Ross completely lost her memory. She was stuck in a 15-second loop, wondering where she was meant to be going for dinner that night and reintroducing her new lover to her adult daughter over and over again. Dasha doesn't remember that day at all. She only knows the stories that her daughter has told her about it. But thankfully, Dasha's amnesia only lasted a day and didn't affect the memories of her life because Dasha's stories are the stuff that movies are made of. From taking off to Brazil as a young filmmaker, moving to Harlem to open a nightclub at the height of the crack epidemic, and then running a hotel with her husband John in Sri Lanka, where they battled typhoons, boisterous guests, and a meddling, possibly murderous manager. She's written a book about the 9 months that she and John spent running the Surfside Hotel. It's called Big Trouble Coming. Hi, Dasha.
Hi, Sarah. That's quite the introduction. I sort of sit here and think, wow, is that really me?
It seems that way. Let's find out. First of all, please tell me about the day that you lost your mind in 2020.
Well, as you pointed out, I can tell you the story because of all the stories that everybody told me, but I actually have no memory of what happened. I mean, 8 hours just vanished from my life. But basically, I was meant to go to dinner at some friend's place, and I phoned them 4 times in 10 minutes saying, I'm a bit confused. Am I meant to come to dinner tonight? Yes, we're expecting you. Okay. And second time, I'm a bit confused. Am I meant to come to dinner tonight? I did that 4 times. By the 4th time, they called my daughter and said, something's happening that we don't understand, but it's very, very strange. Can you go around to see Dasha? Because we need to find out what's going on. But just as my daughter arrived at my house, so did my new friend. And they met. They coincided together. And I had enough knowledge or gumption to know that they'd never met before. So I was determined to be very polite. And so I introduced them. I introduced them 7 times, because I wanted them to feel at ease. Meanwhile, they're focusing on me. And I kept saying, something's wrong, I don't know what it is. I just kept being stuck in a loop and repeating the same question over and over again. So they decided to call an ambulance. Clearly, they thought I was having a stroke.
So they got you to the hospital. Do you have any memory of that, of
not
arriving
at all.
there?
No.
When did you come back to the present moment, to reality? What are your first memories?
At around midnight, it's like I suddenly landed back on Earth. They were trying for the second time to do a lumbar puncture test where a very large needle is inserted in the base of your spine. And even though they'd given me some anaesthetic, it hurt so much that I just leapt like a scalded cat. I thought they were trying to kill me. And I just howled. And in that moment, somehow there was a fog that sort of lifted. And I began to sort of look around and say, where am I? What on earth is going on? Why am I here?
You were eventually diagnosed with something called transient global amnesia. What could the doctors tell you about that? What had happened?
Very little. It drove me crazy because, first of all, it took 3 days. They kept me in hospital because they kept doing more tests and more tests. They had ruled out everything that it wasn't, but they couldn't identify what it was. And in fact, it was really interesting. It was a senior nurse who was on duty that first night that I was there who took my daughter aside and said, look, I've seen this before. Your mother clearly has not had stroke. And so that's all been ruled out. But I think it's transient global amnesia. And this happens to people who are in age bracket that your mother is, between 50 to 70, and it's not permanent. It lasts just for a few hours and then the memory comes back. I'm pretty sure that that's what it is. So that was diagnosed on the first night. But they kept me another 2.5 days before they said, we don't really know what it is, but we suspect that this is what it is. And when I said to them, so what causes this to happen? What caused me to lose? They said, it's a medical enigma.
Oh, I don't like the sound of that.
No. We can tell you what the triggers could be possibly, but we don't know what causes it. That sent me into a wild kind of frenzy of like, what do you mean you don't know? You're the scientists, you're the doctors. There should be a rational reason for this. So that set me off to investigate and to research what had happened to me.
And what did you find out, Dasha?
Well, I sat up in hospital because they wouldn't let me go home. I sat up with my iPad and, of course, I Dr. Googled everything I possibly could. I relentlessly researched transient global amnesia, anything and everything I could find. And on the Mayo site, it had a list of fairly, I thought, obvious triggers that no one would say what caused it, but they could identify what the triggers were. And one of the triggers was orgasm. And I thought to myself, oh. And then I remembered being told that my friend had come to visit me. And I thought, maybe it's possible. But how do you go about saying to your intimate friend, darling, did we actually make love together? Because I can't remember. I mean, it's very difficult.
How could an orgasm cause you to completely lose your memory?
Well, essentially what happens with transient global amnesia, very simply put, it's perturbation of the blood flow in the brain. So orgasm is the ultimate perturbation.
So a rush of blood into the brain.
Yes. And it's so much blood that it just stops everything, literally.
The nuns gave me a lot of risks about sex at school, Dasha, but never was I given this warning, I have to say.
Well, you know what? There's a Facebook group that I found for transient global amnesia. There was a whole discussion one time that I looked up about those who had experienced TGAs as a result of sex. And somebody in this thread had asked the question, so has it prevented anybody on this discussion from having sex? And everybody said, nah.
So is that what happened for you? Did you have this conversation with your friend and
well, I don't know
back?
Because I can't recall, but it would seem to me that was the only, because all of the other triggers relate to immersion in very cold water, like in the case of Michael Mosley, who also suffered, Dr. Michael Mosley suffered the same thing because he went swimming off the coast of Cornwall, or overheating, people going to the gym and working out, but working out to extreme, or somebody had one mowing a lawn in the middle of summer at the height at midday. You know, so extreme temperatures or stress, extreme stress can cause it. Those are the sorts of triggers, but none of those had applied to me. I wasn't stressed, I hadn't mown the lawn, and I hadn't been to the gym. So I deducted that this is what happened. And when on the final day of being cooped up in hospital, and by this time I was really antsy and wanted to get out, the professor of neurology swept past with his entourage, you know, they're like mother duck and little ducklings all following on after him, and he appeared at the end of the bed. And so I said to him, so Professor, can you tell me, I have read that orgasm can be a trigger for this. And I think that that's possibly what happened in my case. What do you think of that? He just looked at the floor. He looked at his shoes. And there was the most imperceptible little lifting of the corners of his mouth in a smile. And he said, well, it could be the case, yes, but we don't know that that's what caused it. And I said, oh, well, that'll do me. Apparently there's a 4% chance that it can occur again. But it was 4 years ago now, so I'm just going with the idea that, no, that was that and it's not going to happen again.
Let's go back to your earliest memories now, Dasha. Where did life begin for you?
I was born in Melbourne, and when I was 1 year of age, my parents moved to Brisbane because my father was transferred, and we spent 7 years in Brisbane. I have memories of a mango tree in the backyard. It was very warm. I had a one-shoulder bathers, Speedo bathers that I was very pleased with. It was a very nice childhood. It was warm. What I have an abiding memory of is heat and this climate that was so enveloping, tropical. And then at 7, we moved to Melbourne, which was not tropical. And I froze from the moment I arrived. And Melbourne was blue stone and it was grey skies. And all through my school years, I wore a grey uniform. Everything seemed to be greyed out. And it was freezing. The winds that came off the Bass Strait, Arctic cold, and they bit into your bones. So I've just got this memory of one extreme to the other. And I think I was always a bit unsettled in terms of living there.
Your grandmother, your father's mum, was French. How had she met her Australian husband?
My grandfather was stationed in the north of France in a town called Amiens, and he was sent to be, cannon fodder in the trenches. And my grandmother, her father was a wine merchant, and he charged his 3 daughters with taking food and wine parcels to the wonderful Australian soldiers that were protecting and saving them all. In the course of that, they fell in love, and she was totally smitten with him. Once he went off into the trenches, she dressed up as an Australian soldier to be able to go and see him, which was fantastic as an image. And then at the end of the war, they married in France. So they returned to Perth, and she arrived in, I think, 1922 it was, with a suitcase of clothes and a bidet. Because she felt sure that she would not find a bidet in Perth in 1922, and she was correct. She wouldn't have.
Was that still around when you got to know her?
Absolutely. The bidet was very, very important. And her house was like a little corner of France. She maintained this sort of cultural pocket, and she was very involved in the setting up and establishment of the Alliance Française in Perth. And so that maintenance of French culture was hugely important to her. In fact, she was awarded both a medal and a certificate by President de Gaulle for her services to French culture.
What changed in your family, Dasha, when you were 17?
My father died suddenly and shockingly. He was 47 and he had a massive heart attack. And in the course of a night, I had been out somewhere and arrived home, and the house was filled with people. And my mother met me at the door and told me that my father had died. And in the course of that night, my life unutterably changed completely.
In what way? What do you mean?
Well, up until that time, I mean, my father played the role of being not authoritarian, but certainly directing me as to what I could do and how I could do it and when I could do it. But that night meant that I was now completely and utterly in charge of my life. No one was going to tell me what to do or how to do it. My mother was completely distraught. I had 2 younger siblings, and her way of both dealing with this shocking grief and also the fact that our finances were tied up in long and convoluted kind of problems. She went back to work 6 weeks later as the editor of a women's magazine. She was a journalist. And I just had to forge my own life.
You headed up to Sydney after you finished school to study and were working as an artist's model to support yourself. What did that involve?
Well, it certainly beat. I'd started, when I first moved to Sydney, I worked in a wine bar that was called The Decline and Fall of Western Civilization as We Know It. Can you believe? Commonly called The Decline. And working there, A, it was hard work, B, it was really poorly paid, and C, I was so sick of people saying to me, geez, you've got big tits, will you come out with me? No, I won't. So working as an artist model, you got paid a lot more money to take your clothes off, but it was all done in a very ritualised fashion. You took your clothes off and put on a robe off to one side, and then you walked in your robe to a dais, and then you took the robe off and you went through a series of poses. I had this experience as an artist model in differing environments. One of them was a very peculiar one in Mosman. It was a sketch club for a bunch of peculiar men who sat in a circle around me, and they had such looks in their eyes. But very quickly I realised that they were harmless. And they'd all bring out their coloured pencils, which they would put in front of them, and their crayons, and they would draw very intensely as you sat there with your clothes off. And as I said, I realised almost instantly that they were harmless and I wasn't going to be in any danger. But I only did it a couple of times because it was peculiar and it was discomforting to have these eyes on you. But as a result, it gave me the experience to put into making my first film with another woman filmmaker called Jenny Thornley. She'd had the same experience.
Of being an artist model.
In this same sketch
With the strange odd men of Mossman.
Yeah. And we met in a women's film workshop and were discussing ideas and things and arrived at this idea that we'd both experienced this. So we investigated this in a little 7-minute film focused on a woman who was an artist model. As a result of that film, I was accepted into the Australian Film and Television School, into their first full-time intake, 3-year intake. And they elected to send me to a conference in Vienna, which was run by UNESCO entitled Humour in the Story. Well, the joke was it was held in Vienna, which is a very unfunny city, let me tell you. And when I arrived at this conference, there was a big dinner that was held. And who strode into this dinner but this Frenchman? And I took one look at him and he took one look at me. And it was literally that coup de foudre. We just both went, oh. And we spent the next 3 weeks together. And then he went back. He was living in French Guiana at that time. And I went back to Australia. But we corresponded by letter, as you did. And he sent me a letter saying, I've now moved to Rio de Janeiro and it's pretty amazing here in terms of filmmaking opportunities and I really think you should come here. And I went, ooh.
It's a pretty exciting invitation.
Yeah.
So what was it like when you touched down in Rio?
We hopped into a taxi and Michelle told the taxi driver where to go. And I suddenly thought, oh, I can't do that. I don't speak Portuguese. And so I thought, well, that's something that I'm going to have to deal with. I hadn't thought that through. I hadn't thought through many things, actually. I just knew that it was a really good idea. And I think the drivers of my life have been passion, desire, laced with a bit of altruism. As my grandmother would have said, a soupçon of altruism, as in the work that I do has to have some kind of meaning or application. But definitely passion and desire are my major drivers. So I was just in love with this man. And so I started to learn Portuguese by taking the newspaper, and I started on the back page with the horoscope and the dictionary, and I worked myself through to the front page.
To the news stories.
That took 3 months.
You and Michelle eventually came back to Sydney together and you'd got married so that he could get a visa. What kind of marriage did the two of you have?
Volcanic. Passionate. Interesting. I learned a huge amount with him. He was fascinating. He had enormous energy and interest and was driven by curiosity that I found very, very attractive. But he was an inveterate womanizer, and this used to drive me absolutely bonkers mad. And I would have tantrums and I'd cry and he would say, Dasha, what is your problem? You are my wife, you're number one. And I would say, yeah, well, I don't want there to be number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the wings. So finally it came to a point where I threw all his belongings out of the 3rd floor building that we were living in on Campbell Parade and said, that's it, basta.
No? No one was injured below you, Dasha.
Well, they could well have been, and I didn't care. And then there was this thing where I suddenly got a phone call very shortly after from the Department of Foreign Affairs saying, are you married to Michelle? And I said, who's calling and why are you asking me this? Well, he's been arrested on the border of West Papua New Guinea. And I said, well, so why are you telling me? It's like, we're no longer together. He'll work it out.
Number 2 and number 3 and number 4 can deal with this problem.
Exactly.
Eventually, with Michelle out of your life, Your career was going great guns. What were you doing in Sydney, work-wise?
I had 3 tours of duty, as you could put it, at the ABC. I worked as a producer on Four Corners, and I also worked on the 7:30 Report as a reporter in Melbourne, senior reporter in Melbourne. And then I worked as a commissioning editor for documentaries in Sydney, an amazing job that I absolutely relished and loved.
Who did you meet during that first tour of duty when you were a producer on Four Corners and were visiting Melbourne for a shoot?
By that stage, after Michelle and I had come apart, I had absolutely no intention of meeting anyone else or having any kind of subsequent relationship. But I did meet the man who really became, I think, the love of my life. And that was a man called John Pinder, who was the owner, when I met him, of a nightclub, a theatre restaurant called The Last Laugh in Melbourne, which became the training ground for a lot of the comedy industry.
What did you fall in love with about him? What did you, in terms of your desire and passion and altruism drivers, what in you responded to John?
He had an aura about him. He was somebody who was very strong and comfortable in himself, and he was an enormous enthusiast. He was a very passionate person. And I was just very taken with who he was and what he was doing and how he was doing it. And I was just swept up.
The morning after your first night together, I believe you had a early appointment with Kerry O'Brien that you were a little dishevelled for. What's the story there?
Well, we met in this nightclub, and of course one thing led to another, and we ended up spending the night together and very little sleep. And then I had to wake up extremely early to catch a plane, missed the alarm, and then had to sort of jump into whatever clothes I could find on the floor. And somehow I lost my bra. I was looking like complete dog breakfast, and had to catch a subsequent flight with the crew and landed in Sydney. And Kerry O'Brien was furious, rightly so. And, I mean, seeing me, who was meant to be producing the story, in the dishevelled state I was. Years and years and years later, I bumped into him at the Logos one night, and I said, I just wanted to tell you that as a result of that night that I know was so terrible in terms of my failure and behaviour, well, I married that person and we had a daughter that we absolutely adored. So it all turned out well.
It was worth it. It was worth one botched early morning start. Did you always want kids, Dasha, when you got together with John?
No, not at all. It was John who said to me, if you would like to have a child, then I would love to be a father with you. I would love us to have a child together. I said, well, that's not going to happen. So I'm very happy. But as is the way with life and living and, the best laid plans and all of that, I actually did fall pregnant 6 weeks later. And that was an incredible shock to me. But I was absolutely entranced from the moment that I saw it, my baby in ultrasound. I just went, oh. And it was a fantastic experience.
Not long after your daughter Lola was born, you and John and she took off to Harlem. Why? What was the plan in Harlem in New York?
John had been asked by 2 Melbourne restaurateurs, Tony Knox and Mietta O'Donnell, to refurbish and reopen and manage an old Afro-American nightclub called Small's Paradise, which was in the heart of Harlem. Small's Paradise had always been a legendary black nightclub.
Why did they want an Australian to run rebuild it?
Tony and Mietta bought this. Australians, it's like we think we can just ride in and do it all. Why not? Why not reopen this old Afro-American nightclub that had this famous history? The musicians who played there was astonishing. And not only that, but they bought up a 5-story brownstone mansion in Harlem, and that's where we were to live. And
In the mansion on the hill.
yes, and I'd never been in New York before, so I was very excited to go and live there. However, once we arrived, the optics of that struck me as slightly awkward and difficult, that we were the white folks living in the big mansion on the hill, and I wasn't convinced that that was in our best interests.
Well, how did the locals respond to you, this Australian family, this white Australian family in their midst?
Mostly whites in Harlem were up there scoring drugs. This is, the very early 90s. It's crack city, and whites only went up there to score drugs. So nobody was interested in us at all. I realised that New York was exceptionally tribal, and you lived where your tribe was. And we were so out of our tribe. We were in the wrong place.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Konoski. Find more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app.
Many years later, when your daughter Lola was all grown up, you and John embarked on another overseas business adventure, this time to Sri Lanka. What was the plan?
Well, the plan was, once again, a sort of quixotic adventure. It's funny talking about it on the back of the New York experience because they're not dissimilar. Grand plans that don't quite soar and take off. I took a redundancy from the ABC, happily, and John was at a point where he'd had a major festival that he'd put his heart and soul into, and it had fallen over through sponsored pulling out. So we went and lived overseas in Barcelona, and during that time, he said, a friend of his invited him to go to Sri Lanka for New Year's Eve. So we thought, that sounds fabulous. Let's do that. So we did.
And what were your first impressions of Sri Lanka?
Oh, extraordinary. It was such a rich, ancient culture. There were ruins of cities that were astonishing in terms of their architectural knowledge and wizardry. And there was a very, very rich history that was peppered by both Tamils and Sinhalese, but it was also had been the subject of colonisation for some 500 years because it was on the Silk Route. Its wealth was in spices, elephants. So it was absolutely captivating, but it was also unbelievably beautiful. It was the quintessential tropical paradise, palm trees swaying, white sand beaches, extraordinary food. But it had been the subject and had suffered from 30 years of civil war, which had decimated the country and decimated the people. And then on top of that, there'd been the tsunami, which had hit, and that had been absolutely devastating. So the country had suffered these huge setbacks, and they were righting themselves. It was like a listing ship that was slowly, righting itself upright again through tourism. So this friend of John's, he was an English colleague, showbiz colleague, owned this hotel on the beachfront, and we went for a holiday there, and we're just absolutely smitten by Sri Lanka. And at the end of our stay there, he said, well, we've been talking to you about what we plan to do with this place, and we think you're just the couple to come back and do that. And John and I just looked at each other. This was after a very long boozy night, our last night, and we went, yeah, right, okay, we'll think about that. And so we went and caught a plane and flew back to Australia. And you know the thing when, for Australians who've been overseas for a while and you get back to Australia and you land and it's like, oh, kathump, everything is exactly as you left it. There doesn't seem to be anything that's changed. And so we start to think about this and think, was he for real? Is that possible? And it turned out it was for real and it was possible.
Had either of you ever run a hotel before?
No. No, I'd worked in television. And I said to John, well, wrangling people on productions can't be that different, can it? John had owned nightclubs, he'd owned restaurants, he'd run festivals. He was very good at providing spaces to entertain people. That was his real talent. But no, we hadn't owned or run a hotel.
But you said yes to this opportunity and you went back to Sri Lanka. Where was this hotel and what kind of state was it in when you and John arrived to take it over?
The hotel was in the most extraordinarily beautiful location. This is a place called Hikkaduwa. It was a surf beach. It had been famous as a surfing location since the late 60s, 1960s, when it was discovered by a pro-American surfer. And so it had been on the surf trail ever since. And then it was on the hippie trail. So it was known as a place to go, to hang out, as being very beautiful, cheap. It was kind of like Bali 40 years previously is what it was like, little bars and restaurants. And the hotel was very run down. It was 15 rooms and it had been rebuilt after the tsunami. But in terms of service and what Western tourists were now expecting, it was getting bad reviews on TripAdvisor. And so the owner, the English owner of the hotel, had decided that it needed Western management. He needed agents of change to come in and to make it into what Western tourists would like to stay at. And so that was what we were charged to do. So we had to refurbish, redecorate, rebuild stuff, and to hire staff, and to also introduce a new menu that was going to be a Sri Lankan Mediterranean fusion menu. So these were all the grand plans, which was incredibly exciting.
And a lot of hard work, I imagine, once you're there.
We worked so hard. We were doing 14-hour days for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. But it was exhilarating when we were both on a mission to do this.
Were the challenges that you faced then, Dasha, on the ground, the ones that you expected, the inevitable ones that would come with running a hotel, particularly in a foreign country?
I mean, the biggest challenge that we faced was that the former manager that we were taking over from, he was still there and part of the hotel, and it was unclear as to how he felt about us coming in to effectively take over his job. And even though we understood that he'd been told that we were coming and why we were coming, we came to understand that perhaps it hadn't been explained in any great detail. So that was the biggest challenge. He was our biggest challenge.
Once you opened, once the big day arrived, Dasha, did the guests turn up?
They did turn up. They were certainly there, but it was a sort of real comedy of errors. The opening day, everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong. Both extremely amusing to retell, but at the time, totally catastrophic.
You say you weren't sure about what the relationship with this Sri Lankan manager was going to be in practice, what his role in the new vision of the hotel was to be. How did things play out between you and John and him as the months went on?
Well, what we began to understand very clearly was that he deeply resented us being there. He felt very shown up by us being there. Everything that we did was an affront to him because it seemed to show up how he had failed. and why he wasn't in that job anymore, even though the owner of the hotel had provided him with land, had provided him with money to build a house, and had given him a percentage ownership in the business, which is where I think this confusion as to what all of our respective roles were. Because was he to be our boss? I think he saw that we were working for him. We didn't see it that way. We were managing the hotel, and he was to be the local liaison because we didn't speak Sinhalese and we needed his assistance. But it became increasingly more and more and more troubled, and bubbling beneath the surface was this continual resentment about who and what we were and what we were doing. And he'd be very critical about everything that we were doing, even after he'd moved out of the hotel. Anyway, you could just sense and feel that this was building and building and building and building, and that sooner or later it was going to blow. And it did.
What happened? How did things blow?
Things blew because the owner of the hotel lived in the UK, and we would feed back information that things were going from bad to worse with Nilinda, as he's called in the book. It's not actually his real name. He had a drinking problem. There's no two ways about that, and there's no point in gilding the lily. And when he would drink, he would get really aggressive about what we were doing or not doing there, and he'd turn up late at night. And this happened a few times, and it was difficult with guests who were there, who'd be confronted with this man who would say we weren't real managers and we weren't doing a good job, and he'd done a much better job with his wife. And John wrote a report back to the owners, which I will never, ever know if he intentionally left it on the desktop of the computer, the work computer, or not. That will never be known. And sent this report off saying, look, this is really reaching a critical point where clearly Nilinda is finding our presence here so difficult, and it's going to blow up. You know, we're just warning you. We went for a weekend to Colombo, and while we were in Colombo, he, of course, went into the office and, of course, looked on the computer and, of course, saw this report and, of course, read it and reacted in an absolute maelstrom of fury and phoned Nick, the owner in the UK, and said that he wanted to kill John because John had said that he'd been behaving in an inappropriate way with guests, and it was increasingly difficult, and something had to happen, and something had to happen in terms of his drinking. So he phoned and said he wanted to kill John. So we're in Colombo, and I get a phone call, and it's from Nick saying, where are you? Well, we're in Colombo. We told you we were coming here for the weekend, so we're here like we said we'd be. Yes, well, you have to stay there. You cannot go back to the hotel. Nilinda wants to kill John. And I'm like, oh, right, okay. You talk to John about this. I couldn't, it just wasn't quite computing. What do you mean kill John?
Do you think it was a serious threat, or he was just emotional and drunk and
we didn't
ashamed?
Know. We didn't know. What we did know was that serious things happened and went down in Sri Lanka. And we were told many different stories where things had gone very badly, particularly in relationship of business relationships between Sri Lankans and foreigners. When they had gone bad, they'd gone really bad. And people's lives were threatened, and people did die, and people were attacked. We were not being excessive in terms of thinking that could occur. And so we decided that we did take it seriously and that we would have to leave. Interestingly, since the book's come out, I've been contacted by a woman who went through exactly this same situation. And we knew that, terrible things can occur.
How did you feel on that plane trip back to Sydney, Dasha?
Devastated.
That it had not worked out, that it felt like a failure, or what?
I don't think I was worried, and I don't think John was either, that it was a failure. It wasn't that it was a failure. It was something that we really wanted to do, and we'd poured ourselves into it. We'd worked so hard over months and months and months, and there'd been wonderful times. It had been great pleasure on many, many occasions to host people. It had been glorious, and we really, really wanted it to work, because when you put so much of your heart and soul into something, it's quite devastating that it doesn't work.
Then not too long after you and John came back from Sri Lanka and were planning a new adventure in Barcelona, what news did he get?
Well, a month after we came back from Sri Lanka, and we were sort of planning our future, and I'd had a great big birthday party, a significant birthday. I had put on the invitation, I'm coming out, because it was the first time I could say how old I was, because all those years I worked in television, you could never, ever, as a woman of a certain age, ascribe to what age you were, because it's a younger person's game, television. And so we're on top of the world. I'd had this huge party, and it was wonderful success. And we were getting ready to go and live in Barcelona. We had applied for residency. We were told that we would be granted residency to live there, and we were going to sell our house and pack up and go and live in Barcelona forever and ever and ever, because we really adored living there. We'd lived there for on and off over 5 years and had an amazing time there. As part of the process, we had to have medical examinations for our tourist applications, and it turned out that John had stage 4 muscle-invasive bladder cancer, which came like, I cannot describe the whack on the head with a 4x2 that was. Unbelievable.
He hadn't any symptoms?
No symptoms.
No suspicions
Nothing.
from either of you that that was happening?
No. And it was just, what do you mean? It was so unbelievable. I don't think that it quite penetrated into my, the first layer of my bird brain, what that actually meant or could mean or would mean. And I just sort of kind of set to work thinking, okay, well, how do we deal with this? What do we do now? And it did involve significant 8-hour surgery, months of chemotherapy treatment, until such time as it was pronounced that he was in remission. And John was determined. When he had the surgery, it was astonishing, because I remember going in with our daughter to the holding bay when you come out of extreme surgery like that in the ICU. And he was just waking up, and he came out of it and he said, "We're going to Barcelona." And I went, "Really?" Okay. And he was just on this mission that's what he wanted to do. So we set about setting that up and doing that. He was in remission, and we had health insurance. And so it didn't seem to me, or to John in particular, certainly not to him, that there was any risk factor here. People thought we were mad. They thought they were nuts. Why are you going to Barcelona? Well, the answer to that was that that's what John wanted to do. And we'd both had this rather peripatetic existence, both before we met each other and together. So home was where we lived, and home was each other, and we wanted to live in Barcelona. So that's what we set off to do.
He got unwell again in Barcelona. Symptoms came back, the cancer reappeared, and you came back to Australia, and eventually John was moved into palliative care. Were you able to have a the kind of explicit conversation with one another about what was happening once you'd reached that point in his illness? Or how did the two of you handle what was coming down the line?
I was guided by John. He was unbelievably stoic, brave, strong, all of the things when you said what attracted me when I first met him. He was a big man in every sense of the word. Very big personality, very big man, tall, physically imposing. Had it on occasions, quite liked the role, I think, of playing nightclub bouncer. And when he was in palliative care, as I say, I was guided by him because he was extraordinary in the way he accepted that this was the roll of the dice. He had cancer and he refused to engage in the kind of discussion which talked about fighting cancer. He said, this is not a fight. There's no contest. It's a disease that is slowly killing me and I will die from it. And he resolved that he was at peace with that. He treated the hospice a bit like hotel room. He was very happily set up there. He had Fox Sports and a screen at the end of the bed. All his friends came to see him, so he held court. He charmed the staff there relentlessly, so they adored him. And he'd sit up there and he would simply say to everybody and anyone, whether they asked or didn't ask or wanted to know, that he had lived life exactly as he wanted to live. There was nothing left undone that he wanted to do. He'd done it all. And there was a nurse one day who came in and I was there and she asked him, so what have you got left on your bucket list? And he just roared out. He said, I don't have a fucking bucket list. I've done it all. Everything that I wanted to do, I've done, and there's nothing left. So don't ask me that.
It's a pretty good state of affairs to be in.
Yeah, and neither of us, in his case, have a faith. So for him, the last breath was the end of it. It was over and out, and he was gone with it.
What kind of send-off did you give this larger-than-life man who you loved so much?
He planned his send-off. I don't think he trusted me. He carried it off. So he produced it. And with a wonderful friend of his who is a television producer, they organised what was to happen, where it was to happen, and he told Lola and I and everybody else that under no circumstances could there be any kind of funeral. He couldn't imagine anything worse than having people troop out to one of those crematorium chapels. And so he was very privately cremated, no ceremony. The ceremony was to be a big party at the Bondi Icebergs Club in Bondi Beach. And what he wanted and organised was that his ashes were to be sent up in fireworks. And it was very Hunter S. Thompson. But he maintained that he had the idea long before Hunter S. Thompson did. And he'd always talked about this as what he wanted to happen. And of course, John being John and a genius at organising things, he had a friend who was a pyrotechnic expert who used to do work on the Harbour Bridge fireworks. So he agreed that he would do it. And not only did he do it, but he built on the night when 200 people turned up for the party. And they didn't know this was going to happen. All that we said was, you're invited to come along and celebrate John Pinder's life. And there will be a special event at the conclusion of procedures. And this pyrotechnic friend had built a huge out of plywood, a mock-up of yellow glasses, which was John's signature. And they were studded with cigarette-sized pyrotechnic compound, so that they all, at his signal, that all lit up like this, and these huge yellow glasses were on the side of the apron of the pool, and then these fireworks took off into the sky, and Lola and I knew that his ashes were in there. We hadn't announced that at all, but that's a quarter of his ashes went up. A quarter of his ashes went up in fireworks on the hill overlooking the Edinburgh Festival. A quarter were spread into the ocean and sent back to New Zealand from where he came by Lola and I. And there is another quarter in a garden in Sydney that we can visit.
It's 9 years since you had this big send-off for John. Have you continued your adventuring ways since you lost him without him?
Probably not enough. I did try and live in Barcelona. I went back there to live, spent a couple of months there and realised that that was a dream that had gone. That wasn't going to work. And I now feel incredibly comfortable and involved in the village where I've lived on and off for some 40 years, Bondi Beach. And I've watched it ebb and flow and change. But being by the sea is my sustenance. That's what I have to have in my life now. It's not so much the lure of other cultures or the shock of the new experience. It's more about being part of a community, and it's more about being part of the ocean that I have to see or be in every day. Want to live, by the sea and be of the sea.
Dasha, thank you so much for sharing just some of your stories on Conversations.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Dasha Ross was my guest on Conversations today, and Dasha's memoir about her and John's time at the hotel in Sri Lanka is called Big Trouble Coming. This conversation was recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people and produced by Maggie Morris. I'm Sarah Kanoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.